You're listening to the Valley Current.
The famous Jack Russo.
Well, I have to say, you're the famous guy. You have the greatest book about surgery that I've ever read. I've been so waiting to have you come on this podcast because I read your book and I listened to the audio, and I love both of them. And I refer everyone to both the audio and the book. And I think the first chapter of the book in particular, in the audio version in particular, is just chilling. And I need to tell you a backstory of this because you'll appreciate this, because I had a near-death experience as a kid. I was basically in first year of college, and at the same time, I was driving a tractor trailer truck in New York City to earn money from 3 a.m. to 11 a.m. I was the youngest class 1 tractor trailer driver. You don't know this history of me, but
wow.
I was totally into cars. I had a junior license in New York at 14 and a half or 15 or whatever they issued. I bought my first car, which was a Porsche 911S. I can tell you that story about how I saved the money to do that. It's a great story. But I was working as a truck driver as a way to accumulate money for what I thought I would need to eventually go to college and graduate school and all these things, because my parents were so friggin' cheap. And I had a head-on collision. After working the job, I had a head-on collision driving to an afternoon class with a New York City bus. And wow. I felt that experience as I listened to that chapter, because I thought this was sort of like what the surgeons were doing to me to kind of make sure that death did not succumb me. And I have to tell you, Jim, it was just such an amazing recollection from 50 or so years ago of that whole set of emotions and pain and everything that goes into it. And I thought to myself, wow, you've just captured my imagination. And of course, I read the book, I listened to the podcast, and I said, I got to call Jim up because, hey, this was solely random that I got the book as a result of reading a different book. And
really?
Yeah, it was a weird, interesting thing. I mean, Amazon knows so much about us that if you read, you know what I'm saying, right? So I thought, I got to send him an email message to tell him this story, because he'll just be amazed about how he reached me in a way that I think was very unique, and that I'm sure you reached so many others with that book. It's just a great work.
Well, thank you. You know, it's amazing. The book is, in 36 languages now. It's not only a New York Times bestseller, but it's been a bestseller all over the world: South Korea, United Arab Emirates, Poland, Russia. So it's an interesting experience. And what's even more strange is that the South Korean pop music phenomenon, BTS, have you heard of them?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they actually used the book as the basis for their third album.
Wow.
And in fact, in that album, there's a song called Magic Shop. And then they put out actually a special edition of my book for BTS fans. So it's a strange ride, if you will.
I mean, I never knew. I mean, I always looked at you as being extremely academic, extremely smart, extremely capable, and you are. There's no doubt that you are. But the history of how you sort of bullied your way into medical school, I have to say, I never imagined that was the backstory on what happened to you. I always imagined that, hey, you probably, like most Stanford people that I know, you basically have a middle class to maybe upper middle class family. You break away from it. You do a bunch of stuff, kind of like what I did, getting out of the blue collar world, maybe middle level white collar. And then you just make your way through. But you actually did something pretty unique, which is you had to convince a committee. I mean, that's a great chapter as well. I mean, I love the whole book, but there were certainly chapters that said, wow, this really tells a great story and something that more people need to read it, because your gumption in getting yourself, I'm putting up the book in Kindle or in the store, in the Amazon store, because hopefully our listeners will pay attention to this, because Into the Magic Shop by James Doty is MD, Dr. Doty, is absolutely one of the best books that I've read. And the part that's interesting that most people don't know is we overlap, because I helped start. I was the first investor, first lawyer for first everything for a company called Neoforma. That was one of the first public companies in the break of the year 2000. And we all rode that thing up. I'm sure we
and we wrote it down.
And we wrote it down too, but it was such a fabulous ride up. And it's such a great story, because actually one of the founders then did a book called Starting Something, in which he told a story of how the whole thing ended up getting started and what we did to negotiate our way out of the issues with Variant and to get the technology out and get the IP out, all the stuff that I've done for many companies over the last 4 decades. And you're one of the key people that came in on the investment round, and you were one of the people that really aided the credibility of the company. And I think it was amazing that they were lucky enough to get you, because you are, in a form, an entrepreneur as well as a surgeon, medical doctor, and all the other credentials that you have.
Well, I think that was a book by McVicker, wasn't it?
Right.
Was that his name?
Right.
Yeah, sure.
McVicker.
It's interesting. I knew our other colleague, Jeff Kleck, quite well, although I haven't spoken to him in some time, interestingly enough.
He's a serial entrepreneur. He started another company. I don't know exactly where that company is right now, but he's dealing with strokes, company called Schema. And
I think Sequoia funded that, and he was running that for some time. And but that's been, I think, 5 or 6 years. But no, I haven't spoken to him for some time.
Right. So our paths overlap, as lots of people in Silicon Valley do, in so many different ways. And people don't know you're also a philanthropist. You actually have done a lot of great work, and I want to get to what you did, but I don't want to leave the book yet, because I think of the book as really the American dream incarnate in many ways, because you pull yourself up by the bootstraps in a way that most Americans don't do these days. I mean, I'll say that in sort of an oddball way, because the way we grew up, and we're roughly the same vintage, I'm maybe a little older than you. We both had the Stingray bicycles with the banana seat. We both were very proud of that bicycle. It led to us buying Porsches and exotic. I mean, that was the era of, hey, fast cars, drive fast, gasoline only. No one thought about electric. That was like, are you kidding me? That's not going to go very fast. Not going to go very long. But we did all those things, and we ended up doing a lot of entrepreneurship, and we still are, and we're still helping entrepreneurs. And we're still very involved, and Silicon Valley is very involved. But the thing I want to say about you in that book that makes it so appealing is you really have extended your human potential in ways that most people don't. I mean, that's the interesting part. And I don't know that Silicon Valley played a huge role in it, because a lot of what you did was really out of Southern California. I think you ended up going to UC Irvine, right? If I'm remembering.
Correct. Yeah, that's correct. Well, I think many people actually use that book as a statement about the potential of the American dream and the potential of all of us. And on some level, I think that's true. I think on the other, perhaps sad level, is the reality, though, is that type of a situation where somebody overcomes the type of hardships I experienced is actually extraordinarily rare. And, so when you hold up somebody, well, see, everyone can do this, it's really not true. I was very fortunate. And as you know, serendipity often plays a role in many of these things. But unfortunately, for the vast majority of people, either the opportunities don't work out that way, and by the nature of the way poverty works, by the nature of family situations where there's drug and alcohol abuse or mental illness, many people actually don't get a chance, which is unfortunate because I'm sure you've seen these pictures of children, when they're 5 or 6 and they're happy and they're smiling and who are poor or in these types of circumstances. And then they take pictures of them at 8 and at 10 and at 14 and at 16. And, you see the progression of their deterioration, actually. Either, they get involved with the wrong sort of people. They end up getting involved in crime or drugs, and then everything crashes down. So while I do believe it's certainly an example of the American dream, if you will, I don't necessarily believe that dream is really available to many people nowadays for all sorts of reasons. And I think that, unfortunately, the way we've structured society with this belief that, this idea of rugged individualism, that, if you don't make it, it's your problem. I don't really think that's, in most cases, actually a fair narrative. It's like the narrative that somehow promotes an idea that people are lazy because they're poor. And I don't know anyone who, frankly, is poor and wants to be poor or is too lazy. But, you can imagine, I mean, nobody can live on the minimum wage either, right?
Right.
And no one can have a family. So I think there are a whole lot of other issues here. But I certainly do appreciate your kind words. And I do feel very blessed and fortunate. And I have a great amount of gratitude. Just actually to mention something that you brought up in terms of philanthropy, actually, it's not in the book, is that I ended up actually, and as you know from the book, I went to Tulane Medical School. So actually, my 40th reunion was last year, but because of COVID, it's been delayed to this year. And I'm actually the reunion chairman.
Oh, nice. That's great.
Yeah, but and they're inaugurating a lecture series that relates to compassion, actually. So I'm giving that at this event. The thing that wasn't mentioned in the book is that I ended up donating to Tulane.
When you could have backed out of it. That was a great chapter as well.
Yeah. And so I ended up endowing the dean of the medical school's chair and rebuilding the library, and ended up being one of the largest donors to the medical school. So, I think one thing I can say is that, when you create these artificial barriers to entry, they're often very unfair. Characterizing somebody's life and their ability to contribute by grade point average, frankly, there's no evidence to support that. And the point is that, here I went, at least nominally, from not being qualified to go to medical school based on my grade point average to being one of the largest donors, and the dean's chair being named after me. And so you can never predict what one individual is ever capable of.
Now, is that committee chairman that let you in? You tell the story about how you had to body block a secretary or someone that was trying to keep you from getting in the room, and she didn't want to make the appointment, and you were going to sit there, and you did until she did, and she was trying to screen the committee, but you did get finally in. Is that guy alive to see that? Because he was pretty bold in deciding to take a chance with you, right?
Well, actually, what happened was that, the woman you were mentioning was head of the pre-med committee at Irvine. Right. But when she did give me this brochure that allowed me to go to, or connect me with the people that allowed me to go to a summer enrichment program. Right. And unfortunately, that woman died, actually, but her and I did become very good friends.
Oh, that's good. That's good. And she could see that your persistence worked.
Exactly. Out, right? And what's interesting is she ultimately, and she was a minority, she went to, was a dean at Meharry Medical College. And then she won an award from the National Medical Association. And I had the privilege of introducing her and making some comments about her work and what her work meant to me. So I was very gratified to be in that position.
I have to say, that was just such a marvelous discussion about how you negotiated with her. You were persistent. You were cordial, but very much like, hey, this is really the rest of my life. I can see what's going on. And then you do so many great things that play out in so many great ways. And I have to say that a lot of people, they can't even imagine that this can occur. And it can, and it does, but it probably doesn't with the same frequency as our generation, because we come from a generation where there was really a big belief that you could pull yourself up by the bootstraps and go from a truck driver to a law student to a lawyer entrepreneur to all these other things that could never be imagined. You can't even imagine that, well, can that really happen kind of thing? But it did, and it does.
Yeah. No, I think this idea of social mobility is very important. And I think probably it was more likely in our generation. But I think it's probably less likely now. And of course, we see ever increasing income inequality, which on some level contributes to some of these issues, I think.
I'm going to go back to the book for a second on the luck of getting to the magic shop before it ended up closing down. Like, in a way, magic shops were common, but they were available as retail stores. And people took this idea of learning magic seriously, in the sense that you could go into a shop the way you could go into like a fountain shop and get a soda, right? You can't find these places anymore. They don't exist, right?
No, that's right. I mean, and I very, very clearly remember that. And you're absolutely right. I think in every town, there was probably a magic shop, and very popular. And it's sort of interesting, even now, if I see one, I always go in and check out what's going on there.
Right, because you went in with the view that you were trying to buy a missing fingertip, like you had a missing thumb, plastic piece that was gone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was sort of a desire to find this replacement part for what you were doing. I'm curious, how did you get interested in magic? Who actually brought that to your life? How did that happen?
Actually, my father did, and it became sort of a way for he and I to communicate. As I indicate in the book, he was an alcoholic, but he was sort of a binge drinker. And when he was not drinking, he was a very nice fellow. And so in some ways that, and again, as you probably appreciate, your interaction with your father in those days was not a touchy-feely one necessarily. And there wasn't as much interest in sort of getting close to your children on that level. So it was a way for he and I to connect. And he certainly wasn't a skilled magician in any way, but it was sort of a fun thing to talk about. And I would do these little tricks, whether it was with cards or my plastic thumb that I would stuff stuff in and hide. So that's how it started. And I actually enjoyed it.
But you probably built the dexterity of your hands as a result. I don't know if you've thought about what led to you becoming a fabulous surgeon, a fabulous pediatric neurosurgeon. You probably built some dexterity in your hands from the manipulation of cards, the manipulation of a plastic object to create the magic or the illusion, right?
Actually, I've never really thought of it that way, but certainly I think that may be a possibility. As you know, if you repeatedly do something, it sort of gets imprinted, and certainly the fine dexterity that you need to do those types of things, I think, is certainly an example of that.
Right. And so are you still doing surgery, or what's been the rest of where you've gone? Because I would think as you get older, you get better. But I guess at some point it's like, are you really able to be as perfect as you get older? Because we all get older, unfortunately. It's just a fact of life.
Well, I think you're right. I think there are a couple of factors there. For many people who go into these types of specialties, neurosurgery as an example, that demand immense amount of focus, dexterity, judgment, I don't think there's any question that as you get older, it impacts you. You're not at the peak of performance always. And typically what will happen is most neurosurgeons, when they get into their mid to late 60s, will sort of back off and either simply assisted surgery or do very limited types of surgery, not the big high power type of stuff that has a very high risk profile. For myself, I have been on sabbatical for the last year and a half. And the reality is that I'm probably not going to go back for multiple reasons. I still love neurosurgery, but there are lots of people who can do neurosurgery. And but the other thing, as you may know, I founded the center at Stanford that examines the neuroscience of compassion and altruism. And that area or field, if you will, at this point in my life is a very powerful draw for me because it can impact not just one person at a time, like being a surgeon, but potentially, hundreds, if not thousands, if not more people in the right context. And with that center, not only have we done groundbreaking research, but we have developed different types of techniques, interventions, applications to help people with their own mental health and also to allow them to more effectively function in society. So that gives a lot of satisfaction to me. And it's also allowed me to meet very interesting people. As you know, the Dalai Lama is the sponsor of the founding benefactor of the center at Stanford. And then, of course, I've had the privilege to also meet a number of spiritual and religious leaders, including the Pope, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, Amma the Hugging Saint, Eckhart Tolle, Archbishop Tutu, Thich Nhat Hanh, a whole variety of others, individuals who I've not only learned an immense amount from, but have become friends with and who have been mentors, if you will. And that's been extraordinarily meaningful to me.
So are you still regularly meditating? Because that's the other way we overlap, which is when I was a kid, I didn't get it out of a magic shop, but one of my earliest girlfriends was a teacher in she was older than me.
Oh, TM?
Not teaching TM, Transcendental Meditation. Herbert Benson, who wrote the book, recently died. So there was an obituary about him. I was like, I knew that guy. I read his book. I mean, I was a complete believer. And I have to say, I do think lifestyle medicine is starting to incorporate some of these ideas, not whole hog yet, but they seem to be headed in the right direction towards this notion that it is really about getting yourself in a place where you can repair. And getting to that place of repair is sort of lowering the noise and creating the silence, not just in sleep, but in this aware silence, this awareness, this conscious silence, right?
No, I think you're exactly right. Yeah, I think certainly I know Herbert Benson and his famous book, The Relaxation Response. And actually, there's a fellow by the name of Bob Roth who actually runs the David Lynch Foundation, and which is a big promoter of TM. And so all of these techniques, and I won't say they all do the same thing, but they all have components that overlap. And I think one of the most important things that happens is that many of us have a knee-jerk response to events that occur in our lives where, if somebody's aggressive towards you, your blood pressure will go up and you'll be aggressive towards them. And these types of responses oftentimes, while they were wonderful on the savannah in Africa, they're not so beneficial in modern society. And I think by mitigating that response, and there's a fellow I'm sure you're aware of, Viktor Frankl.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
He wrote a book, Life's Search for Meaning. There's a quote that's attributed to him that's probably not from him, actually, as I always try to validate quotes that I tell people.
Right.
There's no evidence he said it, but more importantly, though, what he did say does have meaning, and that's between stimulus and response is a pause, and within that pause lies your freedom. So through these meditative practices, it allows you to develop that pause, which doesn't then stimulate your sympathetic nervous system, which of course is associated with the flight, fight, or freeze response, but allows you to process things a little bit longer and actually move into the rest and digest mode or engagement of your parasympathetic nervous system, which then gives you access to that part of our brain associated with executive control functions. And when you're functioning there, you make much more thoughtful, discerning decisions, and you're actually more creative and more productive. So I think that one aspect is what meditation can give you. And of course, it can give you a calmness within inside yourself, helps you with dealing with the natural stress and anxiety of modern living. And, the very nature of our existence in the modern world creates a great deal of stress and anxiety, which we were really never adapted as a species to deal with. Evolution takes millions of years. And unfortunately, modernity has only taken a few centuries.
Right.
So we're living in a completely different environment than what we were ideally designed for.
Yeah, this is what Kahneman calls type 1 versus type 2 thinking, fast versus slow thinking, the reptilian brain versus the thoughtful leader kind of brain. I don't want to really turn this podcast into what's going on in Putin's head. I have to tell you, at some point, I thought to myself, is anyone getting through? Macron has tried to do it, but it's almost like there's very reactive thinking going on. And you have to worry of where that can lead, because he does have a potential button he can press that can change the game for a lot of us, right?
Well, certainly if he presses that button, it'll be essentially the self-destruction of Russia. It may kill millions of people, but Russia will not survive, and many of us won't either. I would like to believe that he would not be that foolish. But as you can see in some of the photographs, which you see this man at the end of a table that's a football field length, right, and with a bunch of people sitting behind him and him sitting there. And it just shows you how separated he is from reality.
Right.
And you can appreciate how power corrupts people. He's a classic example. He's probably one of the richest people in the world based on his theft of Russian assets through the oligarchs. And it's interesting because in some ways it exemplifies a lot of what we see in terms of income inequality. There's never enough, right? You look at, as an example, Pablo Escobar. I think he's making $1 million a month or something like this, massive amount of money. And he doesn't even have enough places to store it. And rats are eating 10% of it. Yet a normal person would do just what he does. He wants more and more and more and more,
right, instead
of sitting there saying, listen, I have enough. I'm going to get out of the drug business and just enjoy life. They cannot do that. And seemingly the more power you have and the more money, it doesn't lead you to being more kind and more generous. For the vast majority of people, it makes them see the world through the lens of scarcity and greed. And of course, the sad thing is, I'm sure you've experienced this, people who have these immense amounts of wealth, they're not that happy.
They're not. They're not.
And it's horrible. And the problem is that in our society, we believe, or the average person believes, that when they see a person who's wealthy, who's showing off, who has this massive conspicuous consumption, there is this belief that, wow, if I just had that, my life would be perfect. If I just did this, my life will be perfect. And I'll get the admiration and respect that I deserve. And the sad thing is this emptiness that people have inside of them, and they don't know how to fill it. And unfortunately, for a subset of people, because there's so many people who tell them how great they are because they're wealthy and they're prominent and they're powerful, to get access to these people, to be near these people, then they believe that that's the currency that makes you happy. And each time they do something, it's a very transitory experience. And so they never fill that chronic emptiness or that chronic empty stomach, if you will, because they're not taking anything that has any useful calories. As you well know, the satiation of that emptiness actually is only filled by being of service and helping people. And I think that is a truism over and over. When you are doing something meaningful, something purposeful, when you're being of service to people, that has immense sense of gratification and makes you feel good. And that's how we have evolved as a species. When you care, when you love, when you have an openness about you, that's what fills the emptiness and makes you whole and gives meaning to life.
Well, Jim, I have to say, I am applauding you in so many different ways for the book, for the philanthropic work, for the entrepreneurship, for everything that you do. And I want to have you on another show at another time when you have more time and when we can talk about some other ideas. I'd like to link you to a group that's studying how to imagine future AI apps that actually have compassion. You may know this group at Stanford. They're at the design school and they're building apps. And I don't know if they can pull this off because I think you and I believe compassion comes from humans and not from machines, and that we can't have robots that really will be compassionate. We might have robots that can compute really well. Maybe they can even create, but can they deliver compassion and looking at someone in the eyes to have to explain to them that their son or daughter has died, that the best effort was done to save a life, but it didn't happen. But they believe, and they want to believe, that compassion can be programmed and can become algorithmic.
Sure. Do you know who's doing that work specifically?
I'm going to find the name because I spent some time with them pre-pandemic talking about, is this possible? And unfortunately, I hadn't read your book at that point. I would have immediately just saw the link. And you and I had spent some time in my office talking about this at one point. I remember when you got started, we talked about this.
Yeah, no. I actually have started that company, and I do believe you can do that. Now, because there were several reasons why. In the face of, in fact, prior to the pandemic, there was already an epidemic of stress, anxiety, depression, loneliness, and certainly the pandemic has exacerbated that. And this idea of connecting with an avatar, actually, there's an ever-increasing amount of evidence that actually you can. And I'll give you an example. I'm sure you've tried virtual reality glasses.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And one of the classic things they do is they put a plank on the carpet. And
right. I've done that.
You stand on the plank.
It's scary.
And this is my point to you is you stand on the plank and intellectually on a cognitive basis, you know absolutely 100% that the floor is carpeted, even though you're looking down at an abyss and you're standing on a plank. And if somebody tells you jump off the plank, 99% of people are not able to overcome their fear response to do it.
Right.
And the analogy to that is if you create the right environment, even though cognitively, you know, it's not human, you know, it's an avatar, you know, it's not real, you know, it's programmed, you will have the exact same response as if it's a human. And there's an immense amount of evidence that demonstrates that. And this is something I'm interested in, in fact, I'm working on, is having an avatar, being able to communicate in an empathic way to make you feel psychologically safe. Because it's, at the end of the day, this is what drives us, finding the environment where we feel safe. And you could argue that in some ways, this is like joining a tribe or a family. If you can find something that gives you that sense of safety, then that allows you to much more freely express anxiety and stress. You know, if you look at the numbers, actually, people who have mental health disorders, many of them are terrified of talking to a therapist, especially if it's somebody provided by their employer.
Right.
And so if you have an entity that is non-human and that they can talk to and feel comfortable with, you can actually have very deep, profound conversations. So I do believe it's possible. It took me a while to get there, but I think there's every evidence. So this group at Stanford who's working on this, I would love to talk with them. I actually, interestingly enough, was talking to a former fellow from Google about this, and he's very, very interested in this concept as well. And I think it's the future. You know, there are a number of companies now that are creating, I mean, I think people call them digital assistants, but you look at There's a company called Soul Machines. There's one called Unique. There's one called The Humans. So there's great interest in this area. Now, most of it's in the context of, I said, being a digital assistant to create empathy when you're trying to deal with, let's say, a chatbot dealing with, let's say, airplane reservations, which still is fucking annoying.
Right.
But I think there is potential there.
What I'll do, Jim, is I'll connect you. I just don't have the gentleman's name, but he runs a group. They are doing a lot of interesting stuff, and they hold kind of a show at Stanford on what is the latest thinking of linking an app to compassionate interaction with the app. I'll find the names, I'll connect you, and hopefully maybe 3 of us can come on for a follow-on show, because I really think that if Stanford and groups around Stanford, this will be a whole industry that might actually justify all of the work that's been done over the last 30 years in the area of VR and AR that still seems somewhat stalled.
I think you're completely right. And I think that focusing on mental health and using these types of AI techniques, I think is probably going to be the biggest, one of the biggest breakthroughs, and probably create one of the biggest companies in the world.
Yeah, and I hope we become part of it, because I was one of the young lawyers who brought in one of the very first innovators, Jaron Lanier, who came up with the whole idea of virtual reality. And the firm at the time that I was with, which is still a great firm, Fenwick & West, was like, yeah, we don't think that's, and we started Apple Computers, so we saw a lot of innovation, but they were like, nah, he doesn't have venture capital yet. And I just think to myself, there's a lot of stuff that takes a lot longer, but guys like us will back and help these entrepreneurs to do great things. And they do eventually do great things for great results.
Yeah, it's funny. Years ago, I was asked by an investment firm to look at a company that was promoting the microbiome before there was much interest in it. And, my assessment was, well, it's interesting, but I'm really not sure where this is going to go. And I wouldn't recommend investing. And of course, I was completely wrong.
Right. But you still picked good ones out of the ones that were there, and you still did well. And the beauty is, like me, you're doing philanthropy. And so I owe you lunch. I'm definitely going to hope that turns into a dinner. And I definitely hope that I can get the people that are doing this compassionate stuff at Stanford in the AI world will join us, and then we can do a follow-up.
Oh, no, that'd be great. I'd love that.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for spending your time with me.
Oh, sure. Good seeing you, and thank you. Sounds good. Take care.
Talk to you later.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.